This is Venezuela in the year 2000. It has functioning markets. People work here. People can buy food. All in all, not a bad place to live. This is Venezuela today. There's no food, the money is worthless, people are dying in the streets, and the government won't even let citizens leave. What happened? How did an entire country go from one of the most prosperous in Latin America to a desperate wreck in less than 2 decades? To understand this, we're going to look at how deadly ideas, combined with a lust for power, drew Venezuela down into a swirling cesspool of violence, chaos, and death. The story of Venezuela's downfall really starts with one man, Hugo Chávez. Through a combination of charisma, brute force, and a poisonous ideology, Chávez almost single-handedly drove his country to ruin. From his humble beginnings in the Venezuelan military, Chávez always harbored ambitions of power. In 1992, he even attempted a military coup against the government. He failed and was sent to prison for his crimes. In a forced apology, Chávez defiantly noted that his revolution was over, for now.
Compañeros, lamentablemente, por ahora, los objetivos que nos planteamos no fueron logrados en la ciudad capital. Es decir, nosotros acá en Caracas no logramos controlar el poder. Nuevas situaciones y el país tiene que enrumbarse definitivamente hacia un destino mejor.
Chávez used his solitude to do a lot of reading and soul-searching. But where some people find religion or philosophy, Chávez found Marx. Was he a true believer? It's hard to say, but his inner demagogue saw the potential to use Marx's rhetoric about the downtrodden proletariat as a way to consolidate his power. When he got out of prison, he began to campaign for political office, this time using words and ideas instead of guns. In the 1990s, a lot of Venezuelans were feeling anxious. An oil boom had promised wealth and prosperity for all, but many migrants from rural villages had yet to find the economic opportunities they'd hoped for. At the same time, a two-party duopoly had emerged, agreeing to trade off power every election cycle, entrenching the political class. A lot of people felt left behind, like the government was only for the rich and connected, and not for them. Chávez exploited these feelings with promises of worker equality. In 1998, he was elected president in a landslide. It didn't take long for Chávez to grow frustrated with the limits on his power. Venezuela still had a constitution, and its checks and balances limited the power of aspiring dictators. Undaunted, Chávez traded on his popularity and charisma to rewrite the rules. In 1999, he called a nationwide referendum that allowed him to alter the constitution, expanding his power in the process. Now he had unchecked authority to impose his socialist vision. By 2006, Chávez invoked the language of Marx, openly admitting wanting the unchecked powers of a dictatorship. But it would be a dictatorship of the people. The government began to seize control of one industry after another. Marxist socialism taught Chávez that central planning would work better. Conveniently, total control of the economic means of production only reinforced his unlimited, unstoppable power. Now he would decide winners and losers, and he was very good at rewarding his political cronies. Chávez used the revenue from Venezuela's oil fields to buy popular support through generous welfare programs. And for a while, it seemed to work. The oil money paid for health care, provided you were well connected enough to find a doctor. It paid for education, and free schools taught children to love their president. But like all government promises, these required more and more money to feed the vote-buying machine. So Chávez's government diverted more and more of the country's industry towards the production of oil. Pretty soon, the nationalized oil industry crowded out private enterprise almost completely. But the global price of oil was high, and oil was in high demand. What could go wrong?
Closing numbers on the markets today. At one point, the market fell as if down a well, over 700 points.
Apple shares were just getting hammered this morning.
We're down by between 3 and 4.5% generally across these markets. What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
Starting in 2007, the world entered a global economic crisis, and the price of oil plummeted. Suddenly, all of Venezuela's wealth disappeared, and all of the goods citizens had been importing from neighbor countries, goods like food and clothing, were no longer affordable. When Nicolás Maduro, a loyal Chavista, took over after Chávez's death, he inherited an economic basket case. But instead of implementing reforms to restore functioning markets, Maduro doubled down on socialism. What did the government do when it suddenly ran out of the cash it needed to buy political stability? Maduro's cronies simply printed more money, lots of it. Expanding money and credit is a favorite trick of bankrupt governments, but it's the economic equivalent of giving a junkie another hit. It feels good, but it only makes things worse. Inflation is the ultimate tax on the poor, as money in their pockets becomes increasingly worthless. 20,000 Bolivar notes are worth less than $6, and inflation rates are in the triple digits with no end in sight. When things started to spin out of control, why didn't the government reverse course? One reason is the toxic ideology of socialism. One of Maduro's top advisors is Alfredo Serrano, a Marxist intellectual from Spain. Maduro calls him the Jesus Christ of economics. Think about that for a minute. With the presumption of omnipotence, why wouldn't they just ignore the warning signs of the calamity to come? Serrano is the one who convinced Maduro that Venezuelans were starving because of too little government control, not too much. He's also the guy who came up with the heartless idea of keeping citizens imprisoned in the country, preventing them from crossing the border into Colombia to buy groceries for their families. All of this has made the current situation in Venezuela feel like an episode of The Walking Dead, but this is not fiction. We read horrific stories in the news every day. One man was caught stealing the equivalent of $5 out of desperation. For this petty crime, an angry mob slashed him, doused him in gasoline, and set him on fire. The state-run mental hospitals, out of money and out of medicine, have become terrifying torture chambers, with patients strapped to beds and left to die. The devastation wrought by socialism has turned people into animals, and animals into a starving public's last resort for food. Dogs, cats, and even rats are being hunted in the streets by moms desperate for something, anything, to feed their children. The food situation has become truly desperate. In 2016, 90% of Venezuelans said they didn't earn enough money to adequately feed themselves, and over the course of that year, a majority of citizens lost significant amounts of weight. Meanwhile, Venezuela has become a full-blown police state. In 2016, 28,000 Venezuelans died due to violence, with 5,000 of those attributed to resisting authority. That puts the chance of dying a violent death at almost 1 in 1,000, an unbelievable number for any country that's not an active war zone. Law enforcement has become largely unofficial, with most of Maduro's dirty work handled by colectivos, essentially vigilante thugs who claim a devotion to revolutionary socialism. This allows the official police to distance themselves from violence, while protesters and dissidents are still treated cruelly. Those who are critical of the socialist government's policies are made to disappear. You would think that the legacy of Hugo Chávez, the death and poverty that is occurring under the socialist government he helped build, would be obvious. A brutal dictator who starved and oppressed his own people for the sake of power. But not everybody sees it this way. Former President Jimmy Carter mourned Chávez's death, crediting him with improving the lives of millions. Filmmaker Michael Moore praised Chávez for using oil money to provide free health care and education, ignoring the food shortages and the civil liberty violations. They weren't alone. Other celebrities were taken in by Venezuelan propaganda. What the hell does it matter with these people? Why can't they see that socialism in practice is a humanitarian disaster, a deadly ism where the lives of people are callously sacrificed on the altar of authoritarianism, sacrificed to a cause that degrades the well-being of each of us as individuals? Let's hope that the people of Venezuela successfully rise up and reject every vestige of Chavismo from their country. The lesson for the rest of us is simple. When governments centralize power and attempt to redesign economic life from the top down, things never turn out as promised. Socialism kills. These are the killing fields, where 1 in 4 Cambodians were wiped out by famine, torture, and execution, by the cruel indifference of Pol Pot. This is Chairman Mao's China, where 45 million people starved to death. Things got so bad that the weak ones, the children, the elderly, became food, eaten by their neighbors. Pol Pot and Mao both claimed the best of intentions. They promised a better society, a new world of abundance, to each person according to their need. They were going to build utopias by planning things out from the top down. So what went wrong? How did these separate attempts at a socialist paradise end up slaughtering millions of people? Pride goes before a fall, and nowhere does humanity fall harder than under the leadership of someone who thinks he knows better than everyone else, the man with a plan. But they ignore what they don't know, what no human could conceivably know. This is what F.A. Hayek calls the fatal conceit. What do these 4 men have in common? They were all credited as the last man to know everything. It wasn't that long ago when it was thought that a single mind could know everything because human knowledge was so limited. But today, with so much to know, we've actually become more ignorant. It's more impossible to conceive of one person knowing everything. This great Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek says, the more men know, the smaller the percentage that any single man can know. This is a common mistake made by socialists and other advocates of central planning. They think that as society evolves and humans learn more, it becomes easier to centralize that knowledge and use it to plan institutions. In fact, the opposite is true. While a central planner might have been able to grasp most of what was known 1,000 years ago, no one today could ever hope to come close. This is what Hayek considered the fundamental problem with central planning, the knowledge problem. Of course, knowledge is not limited to science or facts or anything tangible. A lot of it is personal knowledge of time and place, things that you and I can't even articulate.
The market enables us to extend our ability to talk to each other into all kinds of ways that we can't put into numbers or into words, right? It enables us to have this sort of extra-linguistic communication. Because not everything that we know about the world are things that we can put into numbers and into words. We have inarticulate knowledge where we have hunches, we have guesses. Entrepreneurs who've been in business for a long time know things that they can't always articulate. Yet buying and selling enables them to make that knowledge available to other people.
Hayek, in a way, before the internet, knew that there already was an internet of sorts at work in society through sharing of information, through our capacity to communicate with each other, and the institutions that emerge out of that. Not just prices, not just money, but our mores, our manners, our habits, our superstitions, all the things we share that make life work and make it beautiful. That emerges not because it was passed by some politician or legislation.
Think about all the personal knowledge, things that only you know. Your hopes, your dreams, your aspirations for your family. These are things that can't be known by anybody else. But central planners want to reduce all of that knowledge into a number, into an equation, into pieces of a puzzle so that they can manipulate us from the top down. It does not work because this knowledge, to be meaningful, has to stick with people. It has to stick with you and me.
Many critics of socialism said that the choice is not a plan versus no plan, but whose plan? Is it going to be one plan superimposed through the power of government authority on everyone in the society, or is each individual going to have the latitude and liberty to make his own plans concerning his own life, his values, his goals, to give meaning and purpose to it?
The idea that we can somehow do better than the market through some form of collective, rational planning of economic activity simply doesn't work. And it doesn't work because there's no way for one group or one person to acquire all the knowledge that they would need to have.
The economy is actually an ecosystem that is populated by billions of individuals who have free will. And there's no way to predict what they're going to do. And what they do, of course, is they keep on, the central planners keep on pouring in all the chemicals, which end up killing the ecosystem.
The problem with a single central plan is that if it goes wrong in a big way. as we will soon see. But when planning is decentralized, mistakes happen and are corrected. Like the mythical Hydra, every head that is chopped off is replaced by 2 more, and every plan that doesn't pan out is backed up by thousands more. One of the most famous critiques of socialism by economist Ludwig von Mises points to the price system as an example of how planning happens without government involvement, and how attempts to centralize that planning process always fail.
And Mises said, okay, Mr. Central Planner, you've now nationalized the economy. It's now your responsibility to determine what gets produced, in what quantities, how, to whom it will be distributed. How will you make such decisions in a rational and efficient way that reflects the interests and the desires of the members of the society? And Mises' answer was, they couldn't do this.
When you see a price on something, that single number actually captures a huge amount of information, from the scarcity of the raw materials used, to the amount of labor needed to create the final product, to the relative benefit of all the alternative things that producer could have done with his time and money. As a consumer, you don't need to know any of these details. You just look at the price and decide whether or not to buy. Your decision, along with those of everyone else, provides information that tells producers what to make. But imagine there were no prices and a central planner was in charge of allocating resources. How would he know what to produce? Or how much? Without prices, there would be no way to know how to direct production. The Soviet Union attempted to solve this problem with an elaborate system of quotas. Since there was no way to ensure that the quotas matched what people actually wanted, shortages and surpluses were a constant problem. Machinery was left to rust, unused, while families starved as food was underproduced. Prices, derived from millions of interactions and preferences, tell us what people want and in what quantities. That knowledge, by its very nature, can't be centralized in one place. The only way it works is for each of us to make our own decisions in the process of working things out. Unfortunately, this was not always so obvious. All of the worst horror stories of socialism involve one person imagining they can design things from the top down, using science to determine where people work and what they produce. This was explicitly the goal of Pol Pot, who studied Marx with the top socialist professors in Paris. Given the opportunity, he tried to put Marx's theories into practice. Pol Pot dreamed of an idyllic agrarian society, but he knew the people would not comply voluntarily. His army, the Khmer Rouge, forced Cambodians living in the urban centers into the countryside. Bankers and businessmen, Chinese and other foreign immigrants were summarily executed to ensure that this noble experiment was pure in blood and soil. Those who survived this forced march to the farmlands were expected to grow food, but factory workers didn't know much about how to be farmers, and the resulting food shortage was cataclysmic. Socialism in practice transformed the Cambodian economy under Pol Pot into a brutally efficient killing machine, snuffing out 1 in 4 lives in less than 4 years. Before Pol Pot, Mao Zedong had a similar plan to impose a reboot on the Chinese economy, but his plan was to transform a farming economy into an industrial powerhouse. Farming peasants would be transformed into steel workers, and China would finally match the United States in industrial production. Mao's Great Leap was a spectacular failure, but he did succeed in diverting resources and labor from the production of food. Tens of millions of people starved to death. The Soviet Union collapsed in part due to its inability to plan without prices. And today we see poverty and death in countries like Venezuela and North Korea, where arrogant leaders have tried to impose their own wills onto whole countries with catastrophic results. In 2015, an artist resolved to create a print version of Wikipedia to find out just how big it really was. Although the project was never completed, the answer turned out to be very big. All of the articles of Wikipedia, not counting pictures, would have filled 7,473 volumes of 700 pages each. To read the whole thing, you would need to devour 143 pages a day, every day, for 100 years. When you consider that most Wikipedia articles are relatively short summaries of their subject, and that they don't include the personal knowledge we all have, the scope of human knowledge is truly amazing. And it's growing all the time. Wikipedia itself is an example of how the decentralized knowledge of many people from all over the world can come together. It has created something that would have been utterly impossible for a panel of experts to curate. It's decentralization at its best, and it's increasingly how the best parts of our society work.
You remember the early days of Wikipedia, people were so incredulous. They thought, well, this could never work. I remember seeing late night comedians make fun of it. Oh, an online encyclopedia that anyone can edit, that's really going to be trustworthy, right? They made fun of it. It just seemed like it could never work. It did. And, you know, the guy who invented Wikipedia was the pioneer, was Jimmy Wells. He got the idea from reading F.A. Hayek, who saw and spent his life devoted to this difficult, almost mysterious, sometimes even magical observation that order comes about through liberty and not through imposition. That was his theme. And it's a hard thing to learn, that the more you let go, the better things work.
We've seen that top-down control fails because those at the top can never have enough knowledge to coordinate the activities of millions of people, not even with all the supercomputers in the world. And even when they try, the results have been some of the worst cases of human suffering in history. The only other option is to let people plan their own lives, as long as they don't hurt people or take their stuff. Trust that these individual plans will come together into a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts, and that none of us knows as much as all of us. It's the F-bomb of politics, the rhetorical nuclear option. Succeed in attaching this label to your opponent, and it'll cast instant doubt on their very humanity.
Fascism. You're a fascist for believing that.
He's a fascist.
Fucking fascist!
But what is fascism? What separates it from the other deadly isms? And is there a new growth of fascism happening in this new century? Seems like the concept of fascism is everywhere these days. In Europe, fledgling nationalist movements are on the rise. And in America, radical groups like Antifa have sprung up to combat what they consider to be fascist tendencies on the political right. Both sides display a tendency towards violence and authoritarianism to advance their ends. But when the word fascism gets thrown around so much, it's hard to know what it really means.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
George Orwell made this point in 1944, writing that the word fascism is almost entirely meaningless. Almost any English person would accept bully as a synonym for fascism. Defining fascism precisely is a tricky thing. Because of its populist nature, it differs in every country where it's applied. Here's how the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini described his vision of the fascist state. The citizen in the fascist state is no longer a selfish individual who has the antisocial right of rebelling against any law of the collectivity. In contrast, the Nazi tyrant Adolf Hitler's definition put more emphasis on the state's control of private property. The state should retain supervision, and each property owner should consider himself appointed by the state. It is his duty not to use his property against the interests of others among his own people. This is the crucial matter. The Third Reich will always retain its right to control the owners of property. Unlike the other isms, fascism sprang not from a consistent ideology, but rather as an opportunistic play on the emotions of the people. And this explains why it's so difficult to pin down. Alluding to this, Mussolini was known to quip that he himself was the definition of fascism.
So one key thing about Mussolini was the fact that he was a mastermind of the language. He could talk in the same language people talk. He could make an impression upon them by speaking in a simple, accessible way. He knew which chords he needed to play in order to get into, the collective mind, so to say.
Is the resurgence of fascism a threat we should take seriously? Or is it just a relic of the 20th century, only applicable to textbooks and history lessons? To answer this question, we need to look at what exactly fascism is and where it came from. Today, Europe is rife with fascist movements stretching across a dozen countries. What unites these movements under a single term is the way they appeal to populist impulse using the idea of national mythology and the creation of an enemy against which to rally popular unrest. For example, in Italy, the birthplace of fascism, Mussolini tapped into popular support by hearkening back to the glory days of the Roman Empire.
Nationalism is always about a mythical past, and Mussolini's mythical past was the Roman Empire. So the empire he established, the empire he tried to establish, was to be some sort of a Roman Empire reloaded. That was preposterous. Italy was never going to rule the world, but it was enough to keep up with the fantasy of the people.
By promising a return to a mythologized past, he was able to rally his people, direct corporate activity towards the national interest, and set up non-Italians as a scapegoat for all of the country's domestic problems. Yet for all of his talk about strength and national pride, Mussolini was at times chillingly frank about his goals. The fascist state organizes the nation, but leaves a sufficient margin of liberty to the individual. The latter is deprived of all useless and possibly harmful freedom, but retains what is essential. The deciding power in this question cannot be the individual, but the state alone. In Germany, Adolf Hitler took these ideas even further, implementing fascism in its most extreme form.
Und in diesen 13 Jahren haben sie auf allen Gebieten jammervoll versagt.
Hitler was obsessed with the myth of the Aryan race and the strength and militarism of Teutonic mythology. For a scapegoat, he chose the Jewish people, with horrific consequences. The problem with manufacturing an enemy to consolidate power is that you have to keep coming up with new bogeymen. Mussolini initially targeted his political opponents, but as Italy's economic and military problems worsened, he was forced to export violence to Africa, killing hundreds of thousands of people, and eventually even turning on his own people, adopting the German version of anti-Semitism under pressure from his ally, Hitler. This need to keep the masses afraid and motivated stems from the fact that fascism is a fundamentally reactionary movement. Before the 20th century, most of Europe was ruled by unelected monarchs who could govern however they pleased. With democracy, however, it became necessary to exploit popular sentiment in order to gain power. And since fascism's economic nationalism inevitably leads to negative consequences for those under its rule, leaders have to resort to greater and greater extremes. Mussolini drove Italy's economy into the ground, indulged in mass murder abroad, and got Italy into a losing war, all in a desperate attempt to remain in control. When he was finally deposed, the citizens of Italy strung him upside down and kicked and beat him to death. The charismatic leader who had promised them eternal glory was reduced to an unrecognizable pulp at the hands of those he had duped. Socialism and nationalism are traditionally viewed as opposites, but in reality, much of the difference comes from the way they try to divide society. Socialism divides society horizontally, by class and wealth. Fascism does it vertically, by nationality, race, or ethnicity. In other words, the fascists were more interested in where you came from rather than your social station. And although the fascists remained opposed to the forces of communism and socialism, many of their leaders started out as committed socialists, sharing that ideology's fondness for authoritarianism and distrust of markets. These seemingly contradictory positions led to some confusion among the early supporters of fascism. Distressed by the fast-growing and aggressive communist movements across the continent, some of Europe's traditional right-wing, conservatives, and even some classical liberals were tempted to side with the fascists. They overlooked that the enemy of their enemy was not their friend. Fascists didn't think of themselves as on the political left or right. Their appeal to national traditions, patriotism, and a strong military allowed them to gain support among European conservatives. This is why most people consider fascism a right-wing movement today. It was also around this time that Antifa first arose in opposition to European fascism. But then, as now, it was an explicitly communist movement that viewed fascism as a natural outgrowth of capitalism. Just because a movement opposes fascism doesn't mean they value liberty. Once again, the enemy of our enemy is not our friend. Fascism has never been a uniquely European phenomenon. At the end of the 1920s, the Great Depression had left the American economy in ruins. Citing the need to pull the country together, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt greatly increased government's control of private business.
In the working out of a great national program that seeks the primary good of the greater number, it is true that the toes of some people are being stepped on and are going to be stepped on.
The National Recovery Act was a sweeping plan that imposed fixed prices, minimum wages, and production quotas from the top down. While business nominally remained in private hands, all of the key decisions on how to run the economy came from the government.
It wasn't capitalism because the owners of private property could not engage in real market competition and use it as they saw fit. But it wasn't socialism either because the argument was it wasn't totally planning the economy. It was this kind of cartel-controlled command system, right, that was an attempt to capture what they thought was the best of both systems. Not unlike, I mean, the lighter version of that is some things that we saw in the New Deal, certainly the first New Deal in the United States, which was in many ways sort of consciously seen as another third way between capitalism and socialism. Because the perception, of course, was capitalism had caused the Great Depression.
Roosevelt led the charge to buy American, repeating the persuasive lie that foreign trade is bad for the economy. This kind of economic nationalism contributed towards the fascist-influenced demonization of the other, and convinced the public that government control of the economy was protecting them while at the same time promoting national greatness. The newspaper of the Nazi Party was enthusiastic about Roosevelt's adoption of National Socialist strains of thought in his economic and social policies. Mussolini was also vocal in his praise of the New Deal, calling it boldly interventionist in the field of economics, and saying that Roosevelt understood the principle that the state no longer leaves the economy to its own devices. Mussolini's admiration for FDR wasn't one-sided. The president said that he was envious of the Italian government at the time, calling it the most efficiently operating piece of social machinery I've ever seen. In hindsight, the only thing efficient about fascism is the brutality with which it was implemented. It's tempting to view fascism as a historical relic, a 20th century dinosaur that we no longer have to worry about. Sadly, that's not the case. The sense that national identities are slipping away under a tide of globalism has led to a rash of new nationalist movements all across the globe. Neo-Nazis are being spotted all across Europe. And in Russia, Vladimir Putin's government bears a marked similarity to 20th century fascism. Even the USA is not immune.
The rise of fascism on American college campuses.
A rise of extreme fascist nationalism.
Demagoguery on the evils of foreign trade has led many people towards a mistaken view that isolating our economy from the rest of the world can somehow make us richer.
That American workers should not be forced to compete against people in Mexico or people in China who are making pennies an hour. That's unfair.
We must protect our borders from the ravages of other countries, making our products, stealing our companies, and destroying our jobs.
When in fact, protectionism only impoverishes American consumers while handing over more control of private business to the government. Meanwhile, endless foreign wars with no clear objective and no timeline for victory are reminiscent of fascism's need for a scapegoat to distract voters from problems at home, as well as to justify the creeping surrender of our civil liberties. Activist groups on both the left and the right are becoming increasingly intolerant of one another. And willing to use violence to advance their respective causes. Mark Twain supposedly once quipped that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. The echoes we are now seeing, both from the explicit fascism of neo-Nazi movements and the more subtle variety of economic nationalism that is gaining popularity, should be concerning to anyone familiar with the events of the last century.